Try something here. Hold on.
Sure.
Built-in camera.
Good
No.
morning, Boker Tov, Shabbat Shalom. We're
Okay. So,
Temple Aaron Torah study. Rabbi,
yep.
please begin.
Um, so this week's Torah portion is Vayikra. It's the first portion in the book of Leviticus. And for many people, the first 18 chapters of Leviticus are boring. There's really no other way to put it. The only thing, I mean, the portions that are boring to me personally are actually in Exodus, where they describe in great, for me, excruciating detail, the building of the tabernacle. Uh, because I really can't do that. I can't picture it. I can't, um, I don't appreciate it in the least. When my wife and I got engaged, she said, let's go out for ice cream. I said, great. And where do you want to go? And she said, Baskin Robbins. I said, perfect. And I pull in and I go to park right next to the Baskin Robbins. She said, no, park over here, away from the store a little bit. I went, okay. And we get out of the car and I start walking to Baskin Robbins and she's walking across the parking lot the other way into the home design store. And I said, I'm not doing this. And she said, just once and you'll never have to do it again. And so I went along with it, and I've never had to do it again, and that makes me very happy. But these passages on sacrifices in particular, and the detail they go into to each of the different kinds of sacrifices, is fascinating to me in several different ways. And I'm going to read a small passage of it. If you don't have it open, it's Leviticus chapter 1. I'm just going to read a little bit of it, and then I want to talk about this whole concept of sacrifices in the tabernacle and then later in the temple. So beginning, just to start at the beginning of Leviticus, and God called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when any of you presents an offering of cattle to God, he shall choose his offering from the herd or from the flock. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall make his offering a male without blemish. He shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting for acceptance in his behalf before God. He shall lay his hands upon the head of the burnt offering, that it may be acceptable in his behalf, in expiation for him. The bull shall be slaughtered before God, and Aaron and his sons, the priests, shall offer the blood, dashing the blood against all sides of the altar, which is at the entrance of the tent of meeting. The burnt offering shall be flayed and cut up into sections, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it goes on like that. The first 3 chapters talk about the 3 basic kinds of offerings: the sin offering, the regular worship offering like this one, and it goes on and on and on. The question is why? The question to me is why? Why, first of all, why have sacrifices? That's the most important question. Why did the Israelites, why did God want / need sacrifices? Any thoughts? Yeah, AC.
Well, I wonder if it's really God that needs a sacrifice, or if it's a way for us to it's for us
Okay.
in part to do something to make this relationship or to make us sensitive to life is how I've thought of it in the past,
Okay.
and provide some snacks for the Kohanim.
There you go. First of all, the Kohanim did eat big chunks of the sacrifice. That was part of their income. that along with a tithe. So they had some cash. But mostly it was they ate the sacrifices, whether they were animal or grain or whatever it happened to be. Okay. And yes, I firmly believe that sacrifices were for the Israelites as opposed to for God. But throughout the entire text, right, it talks about you put these offerings on the altar, right, and they create an odor pleasing to God, right? And I don't know about you, but it's not so much when I'm barbecuing, but when my neighbors are barbecuing, I just love the smell that wafts across my backyard. Um, and it makes me feel good. And here in the text, I didn't read that part of it, but it repeatedly says, so a pleasing odor for God. But I think you're absolutely right. This isn't about God. I mean, first of all, the biblical view of God is very anthropomorphic. God, we're created in the image of God, so God must have senses and some kind of physical presence like we do. Not a God concept that, well, maybe when I was a little kid, but not a God concept I've had maybe since I was 5 or 6. Um, and but it is a God concept that many people have to this day, right? Some people describe it as, the giant old man sitting on a throne up in heaven and with a long white beard and judging every action that we do. That's not a thing for me. So if it's for us, why did they pick sacrifices? Well, that was a rhetorical question, by the way. There's an anthropologist named Mary Douglas, and I got this from the Central Conference of American Rabbis Women's Torah Commentary. An anthropologist named Mary Douglas observes that the arrangements of offering on the altar. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Maimonides. I wanted to start with Maimonides. Sorry, I pulled up the wrong text. Give me a second here. So Maimonides says, and I think rightfully so, that God commands these sacrifices. And remember, it's Maimonides, it's 11th century. His view of what happened at Sinai is exactly the way it happened in the text, right? He's not a literalist, but he believes in Sinai and the commandments are God's word and were given orally. But he says this is the way worship had to be because it's the only worship that the Israelites would have known. Right? And we see that as far back as Abraham, right? But they've been in Egypt for 400 years. And these sacrifices parallel Egyptian sacrifices. Now, it's not like Egyptian sacrifices were that much different than Hittite or Canaanite or, even Babylonian sacrifices, but they're coming out of Egypt after 400 years, Maimonides says, and this is the only way they know to worship. And again, going back to AC, your comment, to offer thanks, right? And to express their commitment to this new, for them, this new experience with this God that they had at Sinai. I mean, if you think back to the golden calf, one of the things we don't talk about was, they asked Aaron to build the golden calf. He built it, and they're singing and dancing around this golden calf, but they were also offering sacrifices. And they picked a calf because that's what they did in Egypt. And so it parallels what they knew. Maimonides then, in his Guide to the Perplexed, not in his law code, trust me, it's not in the law code, it's in the Guide for the Perplexed, which is probably one of the most difficult books I've ever read and tried to understand. He takes that to the next step, because remember, the temple's been destroyed for 1100 years by the time Maimonides comes around. There hasn't been sacrifice in that long. And he's living in a Muslim world, so there's no sacrifices there. Everybody prays. And so Maimonides takes this and says, we as Jews, we as humans have evolved. Not a word that he uses, but that's his intent. We've evolved spiritually. And we now no longer need sacrifices. We use prayer. We use verbal prayer, some gestures that we do during prayer. But our way of expressing those same feelings of gratitude, remorse, atonement, thanksgiving is gratitude, pleading, we now do verbally or silently, but with words. Maimonides then has to deal with the issue of the Messiah coming, because he believes the Messiah is coming. And he says, yes, when the Messiah comes, the Messiah is going to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem and reinstitute the sacrificial rite. Well, that sort of goes against everything that Maimonides holds. But he then turns to the prophets, who various prophets say somewhat of the same thing, that in the Messianic times, and even before that, and I'll come back to that in a second, we don't have to follow the law as it was explicitly expressed in the Torah. Okay? So he says we're going to evolve, again, my word, not his, to another level where our connection with God, remember this is Maimonides, is going to be totally intellectual, philosophical, and rational, as much as humanly possible. And he sees that as the future. But for his present and for ours, we're still in that same place. It's the verbal. It's our need to express whatever it is we need to express verbally to something beyond ourselves. And what that means is that for you, these prayers mean one thing. And to me, they mean something else. Now, that may be very similar, but it's not exact. Right? Going back, Isaiah, Micah, others always talk about, is this the manner of behavior that I, God, want from you? And the answer is always no. And it always comes back to act ethically and morally. And the prophets are constantly saying, if the widow, the poor, the orphan are suffering, then your sacrifices are meaningless. Those physical animal and grain sacrifices are meaningless. It's how you act to others and that's what Maimonides draws from. Now, what does that mean for us? And I'll leave that. That is not a rhetorical question. What does that leave for us? Where does that put us? There's no right answer. There's no wrong answer. What is our prayer book services, either in a group at a service or individually, do for you? Yeah, just jump in. Unmute yourself and jump in.
Community.
I think it reaffirms the need for commitment to some kind of larger idea, and as well as in a communal setting, the need for participation with other people in expressing that idea.
Mhm. And I think that's crucial, and very Jewish, right? We don't have a monastic tradition. There aren't I mean, there were a few here and there, but there really aren't Jewish monks and, or nuns or, whatever. Um, yes, we can pray on our own, and we're supposed to but Judaism is communal, and I have always maintained, and I think this is true at Temple Aaron, that at least half of the reason people attend services is for that social component, that communal component. So I absolutely agree. AC, I think you had something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I've had really mixed experiences in the communal worship
Mhm.
zone. It depends on what's happening around me, as you would expect. And sometimes, I look around and I see people sacrificing to a certain depth, and that I find inspiring. And then, if my mind wanders, and
Yeah.
and then I can kind of go back into my own communication level, which is ultimately, that's for me what it's about. Is I'm reigniting a relationship with the divine. That's an
Mhm.
opportunity to chat and talk and share, and because it's a relationship, if you don't, it's just like with any relationship, if you ignore the other in the relationship, then it's going to diminish, and you're not going to feel as connected. um,
Right.
but it's one of those nice relationships where you can not talk for a while and then come back and be like, hey, just like I
I,
never left.
Back
I think,
again.
first of all, I think it's really wonderful and interesting that you use the word divine and not God. And I find that one, just nice. I don't know, just hit me that way. Um, One of my mentors was Rabbi, still is at 98, I think, is Rabbi Norman Hirsch. He's still writing poetry and prayers, and is just up in Seattle. And we were talking once, and he asked me, what do I do during silent prayer? And I looked at him, with that kind of tilted head, huh? Kind of, kind of question is that? Um, and I said, well, sometimes I read the prayers that are there, right after Shalom Rav or Sim Shalom in the morning, right? That lead us, it says, and now we pray silently, but there are actual prayers there. Sometimes I read those, and I have to tell you, they're not particularly satisfying to me. Right? And I said, and sometimes that's when I ask for things. That's when that's my personal petition time. I said, sometimes I zone out and I'm thinking about, what do I want for dinner, or, what's happening after the service, or, whatever. Um, and I said, so what do you do? And he said, I empty my mind. That's when he meditates. He just empties his mind, which is something I find very difficult to do. And very envious that he can do it. Um, and um, and I said, well, what do you do during the service? Because he's leading the service back then, right? And he said, well, I have this ability to multitask. Not a word he used, but I can do more than one thing at a time. He goes, while I'm reading the prayer out loud, I also can focus on one word that catches or phrase that catches my attention. And while I'm reading the prayer out loud, I'm thinking about that, and I'm analyzing that phrase that hit me that day. And every time, it's something different. Something different in the course of the service will catch me. And again, I can't multitask like that. And I find myself when I'm leading services too often caught up in thinking about the details, like the priests would have had to do, because if they did the sacrifices wrong, they would get zapped, as we see later on in Leviticus, Aaron's sons. Um, I think about, you know, is the microphone loud enough? What's the next thing on the list that we're going to do? Last night I was watching the service on Zoom here in Albuquerque, and we had a guest cantor come in who's really a marvelous teacher and leader. Um, and I sent a private chat message uh, to the uh, to the rabbi, to Rabbi Celia Serge, who's my successor here, and I said, "You're singing louder than she is." Right? I couldn't. I just automatically went into that space of dealing with the details. I couldn't help myself. Now, she then backed off, and you could hear the cantor. It's just her microphone was louder for whatever reason, and um, and so I sent her that comment, and then when she saw it, she cut back. In fact, at times stopped singing altogether so that the cantor could be prominent. Um, Becky, did I see you that you had something you wanted to add? Yes, no? Okay. Anybody else? I mean, what do you do during silent prayer?
Well, I admit that my mind wanders a lot too. Um, I like to look, if I'm in a communal setting, I like to look at the physical space, in the shul, in the synagogue, whether it's Temple Aaron or my Denver shul. Um, but to go back to something you said earlier about Maimonides and the use of the word evolution, that made me think about how when we transformed from the sacrifices into more of an intellectual type of worship, that did indeed help us evolve into a more sophisticated is not the right word, but a more, I guess, maybe advanced way of prayer and worship that I think is unique to Judaism in many ways. And then the other thought I had was it's also kind of a portable tradition. It can be communal, but it can also go with us wherever we go, individually or communally. So just some thoughts.
So when you said unique to Judaism, could you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, it's more about processing the prayers and the information and what the commandments mean, as opposed to just passively receiving doctrine that tells us what to believe and how to act.
Okay. Well, so I want to ask, play off of that just for a second in a slightly different kind of way. All right. And by show of hands or however you want to express it, how many of you, other than the Shema when you're supposed to close your eyes, Our Jewish tradition says you're supposed to read the words and never say them by rote. Okay. But really, how many of us during Baruch Hu or Mi Chamocha or Adon Olam or prayers that you've read so many times in English they just roll off your tongue without having, how many of you actually focus on the prayer book and actually reading what is there?
Sometimes.
Sometimes. Yeah, me too. I mean, you know, I do this professionally, you know. Um, you're talking about the Temple Aaron Seder. I got a call that Ghost Ranch was looking for someone to lead a Seder there for their board's meeting that weekend. They want to do a Seder for their Jewish board members on Erev Pesach on Saturday night, and Sunday morning everybody's going to Palm Sunday services someplace. I don't know where. Um, but I'm going, so I'm going to Ghost Ranch and I'm going to sit there in the Seder. And when I'm singing Dayenu or, you know, um, whatever, I'm not going to be looking at the Haggadah, right? It's just, I know it. But when I do focus on actually reading, um, and when I focus on reading, really it's the Hebrew, but it can be the English too. Um, it really makes me think on a different level. Um, you know, so portable is very important because remember, our prayer service began to develop in the Babylonian exile. And I'm pretty sure that the way we pray today is nothing like they did in the Babylonian exile. Um, but our prayer book is based on the part of the Mishnah and the Talmud that's called brachot, that's called blessings. And the service is outlined there, and it talks about how to pray, and it talks about it. But the basic ending of all the prayers, the Baruch Atah Adonai, etc., that last phrase is that old. Goes back to 200 BC, some of it a little later, 3 to 500. Not BC, sorry, CE. So we're saying words that were originally written 1700 years ago, plus or minus. And that's pretty special that we carry on that tradition. And even if your God concept, your theology doesn't, think that, God's not hearing prayers, just like God didn't need the sacrifices, the prayers are for us. Um, it's pretty amazing that we're saying the same words after all these years. Now there have been changes in the rest of the prayer, in the first part of the prayer, but that last line is basically the same as it's been for 1700 plus or minus years. Okay, so what's your favorite song in the service? Oh, come on, you got to have a favorite song
Uh,
or two, whatever.
I like Mika Mocha, I think is what it's called.
Okay.
I like the beat. I like the sound of the words, and I like to read the Hebrew
Uh-huh.
because I'm learning to read Hebrew. So, and I just think it's a beautiful language. So,
Okay. Favorites?
Donald,
Okay.
I like Same Shalom. It stays with me for a long time afterwards.
Which Sim Shalom?
Same Shalom. Tova Uvracha.
No, I know the words, but which melody?
Uh, I guess it's sort of the traditional melody in the conservative shul that I go to. I don't know.
Sim Shalom, Tova Uvracha. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
The Shema kind of gets me.
Shema.
Yeah. The Shema.
Okay. Who said Adon Olam? I missed who was talking. Okay.
Yeah.
So Chuck, do you have a favorite melody?
Yes, but it's kind of jazzy.
Okay. Can you give us a taste?
Sure. Adon olam asher molach b'terem kol yitzir nivra ha'alietna sava chesochol azai melech azai melech azai melech shemoni kra. And it goes on from there.
Cool.
Wow, very cool.
I've never heard that one.
Never.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you. Great.
So where do those melodies come from? And when you said Shema, I assume it was, Neil, I assume it was Shema Yisrael, right?
Right,
Yeah.
it's traditional, right?
Yeah. So that Shema was written in the 1800s by a German Jew who I believe was part of the early Reform movement. Maybe not. I might be wrong about that. Named Lewandowski. And a large number of our melodies, the ones that we talk about being traditional, go back to um, Lewandowski. And the ones he didn't compose, he put down the notes. So, for example, um, not Chuck's Adonolum, which is great. Uh, I gotta find that. Um, but that old traditional Adonolum Asher Malach B'Terem Kol, right? He didn't write that, but he put the notes down so it was standardized. Okay, that's what writing music does. It standardizes how everybody does it, right? But where did he get that melody for Adon Olam?
I don't know specifically, but I would think that there are always cultural influences on where these melodies come
Totally.
from.
Totally. And Adon Olam in particular, or Ein Keloheinu, Ein Keloheinu, right? All those big boisterous melodies that we think of as traditional, right? All he wrote them down in the 1800s. Some of them date earlier, and he learned them in taverns, right? And he learned them in churches, right? I don't have a glass in here with me. Adon olam asher malach, right? Ein Keloheinu, ein ka, right? That's just the way it is. And we take those melodies, right? I'm gonna guess, Chuck, that you're Adon olam, and and everybody else's favorite more contemporary, non-Lewandowski traditional melodies were written here in the States or in Israel, right? And because that's the culture in which we live. And as much as since I grew up with them, those old Lewandowski melodies, touch a part of me. That's not my music. Not just because I don't hang out in taverns and pubs, but right? Yeah, I'm not an 18th century, 19th century German. I live here. One of my favorite experiences um, was at regional youth group camp when I was the rabbi in Buffalo. I went up one summer, and I'm sitting there next to a friend of mine who I'd known since high school, who's also a rabbi, Erwin Zeplowitz. And when I was growing up, there was a camp version, and that's what we called it, the camp version of the adoration. Now, Elena, right? And it was uh, a call and repeat, right? Let us adore the ever-living God, who render praise, right? And it has a warm spot for me because, again, it's something I grew up with at camp. So we're sitting there and we're listening to the kids the teenagers lead the service. And they get to the adoration Aleinu, and I hear Aleinu l'shabeach, Aleinu l'shabeach, L'Adon HaKol, L'Adon HaKol, right? Same melody, same prayer, but in Hebrew instead of English. And I looked at Erwin and I said, because being in Alaska, I hadn't been at camp for a long time before Buffalo. I looked at Erwin and I said, what? And he said, remember when we went to Israel? Yeah, of course. Right. And we took our prayers with us. Right. And we would do services when we were together as in our groups, in American groups. And we would do, let us adore, let us adore. Well, the Israelis heard it. Right. Because there are always a few Israelis with us. And he goes, and over the years, the Israelis took our song, our melody, and made it for them. They just put the Hebrew in instead of the English. Because for them, that was meaningful. So now our kids who are singing this, the vast majority of them have no idea what the words are. I mean, they know the Hebrew words, but they don't know the translation of the adoration of Aleinu, right? Because it's not sitting there in front of them, because usually at a camp service or a youth group service, not everybody has a prayer book. But they know it. And because so this goes back and forth. Or the Shema by Tzvika Pick, right? Now that I said that, I can't think of the melody. Oh, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, right? And it's a pure, I mean, if you listen to Israeli music from the 80s, that's exactly what Israeli music from the 80s sounds like. And he's obviously an Israeli who wrote that in the 80s. Or Debbie Friedman's Ve'ahavta, right? And you shall love the Lord, right? God with all thy heart. Written in the 70s. You can hear that 70s American folk music in there. And it was also different, along with much of the music that came out of the Reform movement in the 70s and 80s. It's in a major key. It's not in a minor key, which Jewish music has been in a minor key for as long as anybody can remember. Because, we came out of the Middle East and that's mostly minor keys. And even in Europe, they do a lot of minor keys in liturgical music. And so, but here we do major keys, right? And it's our prayers, just like Maimonides said, we adapt our prayers. We may not change the words, but we adapt our prayers in the way we say them, just like Maimonides said we would. We adapt to where we live and who we are as people. And sometimes we go back to those old melodies we grew up with because they're comforting. And sometimes we pick up the new jazzy or fun melodies that we hear in our schools and our synagogues. And that sparks something in us. And they spark that something in us because that kind of music is what's relevant to us today. And so I personally find that really to be one of the major pieces of understanding Leviticus, particularly through chapter 17, actually 18 as well, a little bit. Those sacrificial laws and some of the other laws reflect what the culture they were coming out of or living in at that time. And I got to tell you, I when I was at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, we had a conservative rabbi come in to talk to us about conservative Judaism. And he's standing there talking, and he said, and I kid you, I mean, he was probably in his 30s, right? And back in this would have been 77, 78. And he said, while these are the prayers we do today, I'm looking forward to the time of the Messiah and the rebuilding of the temple so I can do sacrifices. And I'm sitting there going, there is no way I am going to take my cute little baby lamb and take it and slit its throat, right? I'll eat a lamb chop. I mean, don't get me wrong. But that's not how I'm going to worship. Barbecue is barbecue. It's not, for me, it's not prayer, as much as I enjoy the aromas coming from my neighbor's yards. Right? So I don't know about the rest of you, but I hope that's not what happens when the Messiah comes. And if it is, I hope I'm not around. Because really, I mean, it's not us. It's just not us anymore. And I know people who learned how to do kosher butchering because there weren't kosher butchers around, so they just went and learned the techniques. Nobody would have certified their meat as being kosher, but they were farmers, and they got a unique, I don't want to say pleasure, but that's what they did. They slaughtered animals all the time, and this was a way of doing it in a special way. I don't think, at least the ones I've talked to, only did it for food and not for worship. Yeah, Chuck.
Okay, this is probably going to be a problem, but I'm just wondering, as a rabbi, whatever you're taught in, or however your experience has been as a rabbi, what is the real rationale for Leviticus and for priesthood? What on earth do we need a priesthood for?
Okay, that's a great question. And for that, I refer us to Christians, especially the Catholic Church. Right? I mean, that's our reference for priests today. Every group, consciously or unconsciously, wants leadership, wants someone to be the leader. Chuck, is there something you wanted to add? Your hand's back up. You're muted still.
Some of the carryover that we have today, like, for example, the first Aliyah always has to be somebody who thinks they're a Kohen.
Right.
And I find that bothersome because it creates a separate class among Jews.
Right.
And I find that very, very bothersome.
Me too. And I never did that. I mean, occasionally somebody named Cohen had the first Aliyah, but it wasn't because they were a Kohen. It was just, whatever. I absolutely agree with that. But groups want leaders. And groups oftentimes, particularly in hard times, want and need strong leaders, or people they perceive to be strong leaders. And really, I'm not talking about politics today. I'm just talking about, human beings in general. And the priests were those religious leaders. And they were trained to do the sacrifices. Okay. Because not everybody was going to do their own, you had to do it right, and it had to be done the same way. And priests today, not Kohanim, not our priests, but Roman Catholic priests, Orthodox priests, ministers in certain churches, still hold that same place where they're the only ones who can do certain things. They're the only ones who can administer sacraments, whether that's the wafers and the wine, whether that's marriage, whether that's burial, whether that's whatever. Only the priests can do that, not in Judaism. From the time of the rabbis, and yes, the rabbis are looked at as leaders oftentimes and are expected to do those kinds of things, not the wafer and the wine, but we do challah and wine instead. I'm expected to officiate at weddings. But from a Jewish perspective, a traditional Jewish perspective, my title when I'm doing that is Misader Kedushin, is the orderer, orderer, of the wedding. And my job, because I've studied how to do it, is to make sure everything happens correctly. But I don't have to do it. So when I'm working with a couple on doing a wedding, for example, do you have people that you want to honor and do certain prayers, usually this translation of the 7 blessings? I know how to do a wedding. Other people don't know how to do weddings. If you go out and learn how to do a wedding and you can get licensed by the state, you can do a Jewish wedding, any of you, if you know how to do it, right? So we've left the priesthood behind, except in 2 places, in traditional Judaism and oftentimes in conservative Judaism, usually in conservative Judaism. And that is the first aliyah goes to the Kohen, the second aliyah goes to the Levite, right? And the priestly benediction. But this is usually in Orthodox congregations, very Orthodox congregations, where when we reach Sim Shalom, right? That part right before silent prayer, the prayer for peace, the priests come up and everybody puts their taluses over their head so they're not looking at the priests, and they spread their fingers like they're Vulcans, and right, they do the priestly benediction over the congregation. And the question is, why do we keep those 2 things? See, my hand's raised because I was moving my hand. I'm really not trying to call on myself. We kept those traditions, particularly in the early days, to put the priests in their place and to keep them in their new place, right? They wanted to be special. They thought of themselves as special. We'll give them something special to do. But these are 2 minor, insignificant things. The first aliyah is a thing of honor. The priestly benediction is in the book of Numbers, where we find the priestly benediction. It says very clearly, the priests will say this. So, all right, fine, we'll let them say it. Big whoop. Now, it's become more than that as time has gone on. But those early rabbis understood that if they were the leaders of the community now, they had to mollify, I will say pacify, but that's not it, mollify the former leaders. Just like today, in America, former presidents still are called president. Right? When you address Obama, George Bush, it's Mr. President. To this day, even though they're long out of office. I don't think their wives do that, but the rest of us have to. Right? Because they held that power. They don't anymore, but we kind of let them down easy in that sense. And this is political. Until recently, every past president has had security clearance. President Trump has decided that's not the case anymore. Okay. And so But at state funerals, they're always there, or their spouse, right? They still hold a place of honor. And so that's why we did that with the Kohanim. That's why we did it with our priests. It was to keep them in that place. Why is this section in Leviticus here? And why did they keep it in the Torah when the Torah was put together after the destruction of the first temple, right? I believe, my theory is, that they did that. The rabbis kept, the people who compiled the Torah, kept this in there because they still had a belief, right? Even though they were beginning this concept of communal verbal prayer, they still had this belief that they were going to go back to Jerusalem and reinstitute the sacrificial system. And so they kept Leviticus in here, because they were going to go back and they had to know what to do. Ezekiel, who was during the Babylonian exile, written during the Babylonian exile, but by someone who probably had been a priest in Jerusalem. And in part of Ezekiel, he has a vision where he flies over Jerusalem, right? He's like going back and forth over Jerusalem. And he describes the temple in incredible detail, right? Much more detail than, for example, we find in the book of Kings, when it comes First Kings when it comes to Solomon building the temple, or Second Kings when Josiah refurbishes them. I mean, he's going into detail about what the temple actually looked like. And that was to preserve the memory, because those Babylonian Jews, particularly in the early years, really believed they were going to go back and reestablish a sacrificial system. I think that the Jews, after the destruction of the Second Temple, even the rabbis, believed that that same thing would happen again. I think that's why we have in 132 to 135 the Bar Kokhba rebellion, a second rebellion against Rome, right? This was led by rabbis, not priests, but one of their goals was to rebuild the temple, and reestablish sacrifices. So yeah, we give priests these two little things, people, when I went to Buffalo, an old traditional Reformed congregation in Buffalo, and I started handing out parts in services, not just candles and kiddush, but would you read this paragraph? Would you read that paragraph? And especially on high holidays, to people other than past presidents on high holidays. People looked at me like I was crazy. Don't you have to be the one that does these? No. My job is to make sure it's done right and to help whoever's doing it do it. So I stand there if somebody's reading Torah, I stand there with them to make sure that they, if they make a mistake, I can correct them. But yeah, and templaring, you don't need a rabbi. You have rabbis that you bring in. You had rabbis, right? Most recently, John Feldman was up there pretty regularly. You got Rabbi Joe, you got Rabbi Steve Foster, you've got me, you've got Richie Address, you got, right, a bunch of us who come through because you want us there. You want someone there, but we don't have to be there. And if more of you lived in Trinidad and you wanted to have a weekly service, you would lead it yourselves. And that would be perfectly fine. A layperson cannot lead a Catholic Mass.
Mm. Mm. Mm.
There was a lay leadership here, my understanding, for many years. There wasn't a rabbi in the Sanders family. I think Bernice, maybe her name was. sorry if I'm not.
Bernice Sanders. Yes, Bernice Sanders.
Yeah, she in particular was a leader
Mhm.
based on some of the certificates and things I've seen on the walls.
I mean, Rabbi Marcus,
Mhm.
Yeah.
what's his name?
Jacob
Marcus Jacob.
Schumacher.
Yeah, he was there for a while. I mean, apparently, and Kim would know this more factually, but didn't the last actual full-time dedicated rabbi pass in 1916?
I think that's what I read on the wall.
And you know, this community is continuing to survive and hopefully thrive. Yeah. So
Mhm. I was going to
thanks.
say thrive, but yeah,
Yeah, yeah, definitely. That's the plan.
I, you're muted. I see your lips moving.
I think the rabbi that later that was in the military and later was in Wichita for quite a while was the last full-time rabbi. And then Gilbert Sanders, I believe, was the lay leader for a while, and his wife B was the longtime leader through the 40s and 50s. And then Catherine Rubin and others sort of took the ball from there. But
Mhm. So let me ask you this. Okay. Why is it that you have me, Rabbi Joe, the others rotate through and lead Torah study? Why?
Well, I think one reason is you gentlemen and women, you sacrificed your time to do a lot of learning, and so you have what to give over in terms of knowledge, and so we look to you to share that with us.
Right. So exactly. Would you have pretty much any of us, as far as I know, looking at, who's been on the list, would you have any of us come in and give a lecture on how to perform oral surgery? No, of course not. Right? Maybe one of us is a dentist and I'm not aware of it. I do put that caveat in there, right? Or how to file, how to litigate a lawsuit against pharmaceutical companies or whatever, right? We've done the studying. That's why we're the ones who make sure the wedding is done correctly. We don't have to do the wedding. You have us in to teach on things that we have studied. So when Richie Address is here, right, he's studied aging from a Jewish perspective for as long as I can remember. I've known him for more years than I care to remember. Uh, well over 40. And he's been studying aging that whole time. This wasn't something he came to as he got, aged. Uh, this was something that he's been doing for a long, long time. Maybe not the whole 40 years, but certainly a long, not, this isn't something recent. So he did that sacred aging class for you, right? Because that's his expert. I couldn't do that. You know, I'm just fascinated by the fact that this summer I turned 70. I mean, I'm not weirded out by it, but I mean, I'm not freaked out by it. I am weirded out by it because how the hell did I get to be this old? Um, right? It's not a panicky kind of thing. It's not a crisis thing, but it's like, wow, my parents didn't make it this far. Um, you know, my only relative who made it this far was my aunt who lived to 105. We don't know where she came from, but um, you know, I know a lot about aging, but my aging, I don't know about sacred aging. I mean, other than what I've studied with Richie Address. So yeah, that's why you have us, and that's why these instructions are in here for the priests, um, because the priests had back then had to have the knowledge, and the people who put the Torah together and stitched those original sheets of parchment together, kept this in here because they thought they were going back and doing this. Turned out that some of them did. The majority didn't, but some of them did. You do know that less than 25% of the Jewish population in Babylonia came back, right? It's kind of like today. Most Jews don't live in Israel. So it was only about a quarter of the population at most that went back after the Babylonian exile with Ezra and Nehemiah. So it's we have certain knowledge. They had to have certain knowledge. If this was my job doing these sacrifices, I would not have become a rabbi. Yeah, AC.
So kind of related. You talked about melodies, and that's very much, I think, a part of the communal experience. Is we come together, we sing, we all know the same songs. If you've gone to like different communities, I used to go once in a while in San Francisco to a Syrian Jewish synagogue, and they all knew the melodies. When they kicked in, they all got behind it, and I was like, whoa, I don't know these.
That's right.
It's a whole different animal.
Right.
So that was a cool experience to realize, like, oh yeah, these are to them as ours are to me. And you go to Italy or Sephardim or wherever you have that experience. It's kind of eye opening.
Yemenite is
Yeah.
really one of my favorites, although I couldn't go very often. But I just remember being at a Yemenite shul once and listening, and it was like, wow. The same is true with food, by the way.
Yeah.
Right? Charosis, since Pesach is coming, and you're having a Seder, which we're going to plug in a minute. Right? Charoset, apples, honey, wine, nuts for those who aren't allergic, right? That's European. I don't even know where the apples came from because Europe didn't have apples, or if they did, but they didn't really eat them. But if you go to a Sephardic, a Mediterranean Jewish community, it's figs and dates and wine and honey, maybe nuts. I don't know. I am allergic, so but it's a different charoset. And if you went to one of those seders and you were expecting, charoset is what made it Passover for you, you wouldn't get it. It wouldn't be Pesach for you, right? Brisket, gefilte fish, bagels, all that stuff comes out of Europe. And right. But hummus, falafel, pita comes out of the Mediterranean Jewish world. We just took it from other people. We didn't invent it. I was actually, I don't know if any of you do the New York Times crossword, or maybe it was the Apple crossword. I forget. But they had a clue, Romanian dance done at weddings.
Hmm.
4 letters. What is it?
The
Hora.
Hora.
Yeah, it's the hora. It's like, we didn't invent it. Why is it a national Israeli dance, if there is such a thing anymore, right? Because a lot of Romanian and Eastern European Jews showed up in Israel and brought it with them, right?
Stroke.
An Egyptian Jew never would have seen the hora. One of the things that's happening in Israel, which I'm sad about, is that even Sephardic Mizrahi Orthodoxy is becoming more Ashkenazic. And it makes me sad because we're at risk of losing some of those incredible traditions. So the easiest example for that is in Sephardic Jewry, right, Sephardic countries, they're much more logical. They don't believe that chicken is meat in the same way that a cow is meat, right? Because I don't know about you, but there's not a chicken around that I've ever heard of that gave milk. So there's no way you can cook a chicken and risk cooking. So they have still in Sephardic, Middle Eastern, North African Jewish culture, they mix milk products and chicken. But if you're in Israel today and you want to open a kosher restaurant, you cannot, even if that's your tradition. So Israel is becoming that kind of melting pot synthesis of lots of Jewish stuff into what will become its own unique thing. But right now, it's leaning Ashkenazi, um, it's leaning European. But that's normal. We take from where we're at, and we bring what we have to new places. When Rabbi Sergey came here to Albuquerque after me, she came here from London, and before that she was in Paris, and she grew up in Geneva. So she's brought all sorts of stuff here that I had no clue about, and it's fun. I mean, for me, it's fun. I think that's great. Establish a new tradition here. So cool. You know, whatever. So, any other questions or comments or?
Just a little comment about traditions. It's wonderful this morning sitting here and listening to you, and I live in East Central Denver, which is kind of what I call the suburban shtetl. And while you're talking and we're talking about Torah, there's a steady stream of people walking by my window going to shul, and it's just part of the rhythm of the neighborhood.
Mhm.
It's just really cool. And so it made for a great morning. Thank you.
All right, Neil, you want to? Somebody else? You want to push the Seder here, or AC?
Sure, and AC too. If you want to,
Yeah.
next weekend we have a Seder at the temple. Please, anyone who can make it, come down. What do we have? How's the schedule going? AC? Do we have Friday night?
No, it's going to be Saturday night, April 12th. It's doors till 5:30, and we'll start the Seder, hopefully hard 6 o'clock. And
Okay.
Rabbi Joe Charnas, JC, and AC will be co-hosting and getting everybody involved. It's going to be a catered meal. You can go on the website and register. And yeah, some people have registered. There's some folks coming from out of town. There's some local yokels. And more people, new people have been coming to events that we've had, our Purim party. So
Great.
yeah, it's going to be awesome.
Yeah, we've had a number of people register, and we still have some seats available. We had like 50 people show up for Hanukkah. What I was wondering is, was this going to be a Friday night service, a Shabbat service, or no? Well, we don't know.
Yeah,
Still
no,
thinking.
yeah,
Okay, that's
yeah.
fine. No worries, no worries. So
Seder,
yeah, next
Seder for the Seder.
And
next Saturday, the Seder. Come on over, guys. Come down.
let us pray that the passes are not snowed closed.
Yeah.
Yes, please, please, please. Also, there's a large event on May 8th that we're putting together for the town of Trinidad to try to promote the town of Trinidad as an option to consider and a nice place to live. And I don't want to get into too much detail now, but if anyone has any questions, please ask. It's May 8th. Thanks.
Leslie?
Yes, we have in Grand Junction, we have 110 people that have reserved for the Seder on Saturday.
Oh, that's
Wow.
great.
That's great.
For the second night. The first night, the congregants will be having a Seder in their homes.
Let's see. Great. Nice. Mazel tov. Well,
My,
good,
Where do you
Rabbi.
have the
Thank you
Seder?
so much. Thank you.
my wife used to live in Meeker, and for her, Grand Junction was a regular stop because it had a movie theater and a Chinese restaurant. I don't know if it still does. Anyhow, thank you all. Have a great Shabbos, a good week.
Thank you.
And oh, what a great looking dog.
Yeah, this is my chaver right here.
My dog decided not to participate today. Usually she's trying to jump on my lap. Uh,
I saw him on your couch earlier.
yeah.
Wrapped.
Anyhow, Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Shabbat shalom.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Shabbat shalom. Be well. Thank you, Rabbi.
Rabbi, quick question. Yeah,